He was declared dead, a piece of paper signed by two physicians, placed in a morgue drawer for more than 20 hours, nailed into a coffin, and months later he would knock on his sister's door and tell her he had heard his own funeral. This is the documented, disputed, and deeply unsettling story of Clairvius Narcisse, the Haitian peasant who became, to the wider world, the most famous alleged case of a real-life zombie. In late April of 1962, in a rural region of Haiti, a man named Clairvius, often recorded as Clevis in local documents, was admitted to the Albert Schweitzer Hospital. According to hospital records and later testimony, he suffered a sudden severe illness, high fever, confusion, and symptoms that resembled a hypertensive crisis and pulmonary edema. Two physicians signed a death certificate dated April 30, 1962, listing those conditions as the causes of death. His body remained in the hospital morgue for more than 20 hours before being handed to relatives. The burial, as family members later described, and as later investigators recorded, was solemn and final, a coffin nailed shut, graveside prayers said by neighbors and parishioners alike. Those initial bureaucratic facts, the admission, the signed death certificate, the prolonged time in a morgue, and the burial, are not the parts of the story most easily dismissed as myth. They are the foundation upon which everything else is built: a paper record, witnesses who handled his remains, and a community that mourned him. What followed is where documents thin and witness accounts, cultural interpretation, and scientific hypotheses collide. According to Narcisse's own reported testimony and the accounts of his family, several nights after the burial, his mind was not at rest. He later said he remembered waking, finding himself unable to move, sensing people around him working on the coffin, and feeling a small stake or nail penetrate the wood. He recalled being carried from the grave, carried by hands he could not fight, and placed into a vehicle. That vehicle, he said, drove him far away to a sugar plantation, where he labored under the supervision of a man locally identified as a bokor, a ritual specialist sometimes hired as much as feared, who in Haitian Vodou lore can be a healer and a sorcerer, depending on who tells the story. The word bokor appears in many reports. In older transcriptions, it sometimes appears as boko. We will use the standard Haitian term bokor and note where local or transcribed names appear in original sources. According to family members and later interviews, Narcisse, once at the plantation, existed in a state of extreme passivity. He performed back-breaking work harvesting cane alongside perhaps 100 other men and women, described in similar terms by neighbors: vacant, obedient, and under constant oversight.
They were given a daily dose of a mysterious mixture, a potion or powder dissolved in liquid, which, according to accounts, was administered by their controllers. Over time, driven by hunger and lack of autonomy, they became the labor force of an isolated estate. It is important to separate two parallel threads in this episode: the documented bureaucratic facts we have already noted, and the claims about ritual and chemical control. The first rests on written hospital records and family testimony. The second is assembled from eyewitness reports, local oral history, and later scientific investigation that attempted to reconcile the eyewitness claims with known pharmacology. On the plantation, Narcisse's memory and will were said to be essentially gone. He could not recall his name, his family, or his past life. He later described his experience as a kind of sleepwalking obedience. He ate and worked, but felt no agency. For 2 years, according to his testimony and that of his sister Angelina, who eventually identified him, he remained effectively enslaved. He was part of a group of people who, by local report, had been similarly taken after being declared dead, a phenomenon that for outsiders resembled folklore come to life. The breaking point, again according to reported testimony and local records, came in violent fashion. One day, while on the plantation, the group under the Boker's control allegedly rose up. In some retellings, a dispute escalated and the Boker was killed by one of the laborers. In others, a more organized act of resistance overthrew his authority. Once the Boker was dead, those who had been forced to take the daily potion found themselves without the overseer who had controlled their supply. Without the regular administration of the substance, several began to regain coherent thought and physical sensibility. Some walked away almost immediately. Others, like Narcisse, recovered more slowly. Memory came back in fragments, identity reassembled piece by piece, and after much wandering and confusion, he eventually made his way back to his native village. The reunion with his sister Angelina would provide the clearest bridge from the extraordinary back to the painfully human. When he knocked on her door years later, he told her he had been in a place where he worked day after day, took a bitter drink, and had heard the prayers recited at his funeral. Angelina recognized him not merely by sight, his face had aged, but through intimate knowledge no outsider could have, private nicknames, shared childhood memories, small family details. She confirmed his identity to the community and to later investigators. It was her certainty, coupled with documentary evidence of his earlier death certificate, that turned a rumor into a case that scholars and journalists could not ignore.
Into that gap between local testimony and scientific curiosity stepped Wade Davis, a Canadian ethnobotanist and Harvard-trained scholar, who in the 1980s traveled to Haiti to investigate these reports firsthand. Davis collected samples, interviewed witnesses, and brought back detailed descriptions of the powders and potions said to produce death-like states. He published his findings in a book aimed at the general public, describing a complex blend allegedly used by some bokers, a neurotoxin derived from pufferfish, tetrodotoxin, combined with various plant-based deliriants and psychoactive agents. In his account, a sufficient dose of tetrodotoxin could suspend respiration and reduce metabolism to near undetectable levels, convincingly simulating death to those without advanced medical testing. A follow-up regimen of sedatives and deliriants administered daily could then foster a prolonged, apathetic, and suggestible state, while social coercion and the threat of violence maintained control. In Davis's telling, the substance known by some informants as a death powder, transcribed in some sources with local names such as Bayaku or Boko for the practitioner, and other terms like erva di diabo, a transcribed local name, were key clues. He posited a pharmacological mechanism to explain how an apparently dead body could be buried and then later come back to a state of life that was altered, subdued, and dependent. Davis's hypothesis was dramatic because it offered a bridge between a culturally loaded explanation and a physiological process intelligible to laboratory science. But the story does not finish itself in neat experimental proof. After Davis published his account, scientists and medical experts scrutinized both his evidence and his interpretations. Some toxicologists acknowledge that tetrodotoxin, in high enough doses, can produce paralysis so profound that pulse and breath become difficult to detect with simple field methods. Trace amounts of potent neurotoxins were reportedly found in some samples Davis sent for analysis. Yet other analyses failed to reproduce definitive diagnostic levels of tetrodotoxin in exhumed samples or in powder seized in the field. Critics pointed out methodological flaws, contamination of samples, the difficulty of establishing chain of custody in remote areas, and the challenge of distinguishing environmental residues from meaningful pharmacological doses. Beyond analytical ambiguity, some scholars argued that the social context must not be overlooked. Haitian history is scarred by slavery, plantation labor, and the heavy hand of outside powers. In many rural communities, voodoo and local authority structures have served multiple functions: spiritual, legal, and social. Scholars pointed out that coercion and social marginalization could account for long-term submissive behavior.
If a man believed himself dead, if he had been physically isolated, threatened, or repeatedly drugged, his capacity for resistance could be severely compromised. Some critics suggested that the cultural label zombie had been used by outsiders to exoticize suffering that, in local terms, might be more accurately understood as kidnapping, forced labor, or psychiatric affliction compounded by social coercion. There were additional critiques of Davis's framing. Some anthropologists cautioned against casting voodoo practitioners broadly as malicious sorcerers. Many Bokars serve as community mediators or are themselves marginalized figures operating within complex moral economies. Other critics said Davis's narrative, compelling as it was, risked re-entrenching colonial tropes, the Western scientist arriving with instruments and theories to explain the mysteries of non-Western peoples. That critique does not negate the sincerity of the suffering documented in Narcisse's case. Instead, it calls for humility in interpretation. What remains clear across testimonies and investigative reports is that Narcisse suffered a profound and prolonged loss of autonomy. Whether that condition was induced primarily by powerful neurotoxins, by psychological and social coercion, by a combination of both, or by some other process, is still debated. The signed death certificate and the morgue record anchor the account in a bureaucratic reality. There was, on paper and in the memories of his village, a man declared dead. Whether that declaration represented the biological end of life, a period of severe physiological depression, or a misdiagnosis complicated by later tampering cannot be settled with absolute certainty from available sources. The human cost in the middle of this debate is seldom disputed. For Narcisse, there was the theft of years. For Angelina and the family, there was the grief of a funeral and the shock of recognition years later. For the men and women on the plantation, there were hard seasons under the hot Caribbean sun,
repetitive labor, and a deprivation of dignity. The sensational label zombie has drawn attention, but it risks flattening the experience into a single word that obscures suffering, context, and agency. The wider cultural impact of the Narcisse affair is another story. In the 1980s and beyond, the case captured international imagination, in part because it seemed to merge several modern obsessions: the unknowns of ethnobotany, the enduring power of ritual, and the horror of human exploitation. Davis's book, The Serpent and the Rainbow, and the subsequent Hollywood adaptation by Wes Craven turned the episode into popular culture. Film and fiction amplified the eerie elements of the tale, which drew attention but also simplified nuance. For many viewers abroad, the story became a convenient shorthand. Voodoo equals witchcraft, Bokars equals villains. Haiti becomes a place of mystery and danger.
Inside the Academy, the case remained a touchstone for discussions about methodology and ethics. How should researchers approach communities whose spiritual vocabulary differs from scientific categories? How should they collect and analyze samples when legal and logistical frameworks are thin? When dealing with vulnerable people who may be victims of crime or of medical misunderstanding, what are the responsibilities of the investigator? To intervene, to report, to respect confidentiality? These are not abstract queries. Investigations in the Narcisse case sometimes blurred the line between science and spectacle. They raised questions about consent, the handling of cultural knowledge, and the potential for harm when researchers publish sensational conclusions about marginalized communities. Some experiments lent partial support to a biochemical explanation. Tetrodotoxin, the potent neurotoxin associated with certain pufferfish species, is known to block sodium ion channels in nerves and muscles, producing paralysis that can mimic clinical death if respiration is depressed. Animal studies and clinical reports have demonstrated the drug's capacity to produce very low metabolic states. Yet translating that pharmacology into the social scenario described in Haiti, where a single exhumed body could be revived and then rendered compliant for years, requires many additional steps and assumptions: the precise formulation and dosing of powders, the logistics of delivery, and the long-term effects of repeated administration. The available chemical analyses and pharmacological models did not and still do not resolve those uncertainties in a way that convinces all observers. Other researchers proposed alternative frameworks. Some pointed to psychiatric disorders like dissociative states or catatonia, perhaps precipitated by trauma, illness, and social isolation. Others emphasized economic motives. The abduction and forced labor of people could be explained as criminal exploitation rather than occult mastery. Still others suggested a dialectic. A pharmacological event might initiate a vulnerability that was then sustained by social conditions and ritual authority. In that hybrid view, the cause of Narcisse's 2-year subjugation on a plantation would be both chemical and structural. In the years after his return, Narcisse lived as a public symbol of a complicated reality. He gave interviews, appeared before journalists, and recounted his experience in the language and imagery that made sense to him and his community. Some outsiders were skeptical of his claims, some sympathized. He became an emblem of the collision between local knowledge and external curiosity. He would die years later. Reports vary on dates and age, with some sources recording his death in 1994 and others noting an age of around 72. A man whose life had been stretched along a line that began with clinical documentation and ran through memory, rumor, science, and spectacle. What then should we take from this story? First, that the recorded facts around Narcisse's death certificate, the morgue time, and the burial are reliable anchors. They are documentary marks that compel further inquiry, not casual folklore. Second, that the most dramatic claims, exhumation, ritual, the administration of a powder inducing a death-like state, are supported by witness testimony and some ethnobotanical leads, but they do not amount to a settled scientific explanation. Third, that the social dynamics of Haiti, a nation shaped by colonialism, enslavement, and economic exploitation, provide crucial context for understanding why people might be vulnerable to abduction, why ritual authority might be invoked as justification or control, and why such narratives resonate so strongly with outsiders. The Narcisse case also forces a broader ethical reflection about how knowledge is produced. When a Western scientist suggests a biochemical mechanism, and when journalists amplify a story of real zombies, there is a risk of flattening complex people into curiosities.
Conversely, dismissing local testimony as mere superstition risks overlooking forms of harm that do not neatly map onto familiar categories of crime or disease. Responsible inquiry requires listening without reducing, testing without exploiting, and interpreting without erasing the dignity of those whose lives are at stake. Finally, the case persists because it sits at the uneasy boundary between life and death, between the measurable and the ineffable, between medicine and magic. It asks uncomfortable questions. How certain can we be that someone declared dead is beyond return? How often have simple field diagnoses been wrong? How do social power and cultural meaning shape what counts as alive or dead? And what responsibility do outsiders bear when they seek to explain suffering in communities they study? When we say, "the man who became a zombie," we echo a headline that captures attention, but also risks obscuring the fuller truth. A man lost years of his life, was seen and recognized by his family, and became the center of a debate that touches on pharmacology, anthropology, and human rights. His story resists easy resolution. If this deep dive into a complicated mystery is the kind of content you want, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more stories like this ahead. For those who wish to follow the evidence themselves, Wade Davis's book, The Serpent and the Rainbow, remains the most famous popular account. It lays out the ethnobotanical hypothesis and the fieldwork that brought Narcisse's case to worldwide attention.
Read it alongside critical academic responses that emphasize context, method, and ethics. Consider primary sources where possible: hospital records, contemporaneous journalistic reporting, and interviews with Haitian scholars and community members. As you weigh these materials, ask not just what explanation seems most dramatic, but which account best honors the people at the center of the story. Clairvius Narcisse was not a mere cultural cipher. He was a man whose life was recorded on a death certificate, whose body spent long hours in a morgue drawer, who was buried under a nailed coffin, and who, by his own testimony, by his sister's recognition, and by the later work of investigators, returned to the world with a story that challenged definitions and stirred imaginations. Whether that return was primarily the result of toxins, coercion, misdiagnosis, or some combination thereof, the enduring lesson may be this: human vulnerability and human dignity are too often the true subjects behind the myths we tell. What do you think explains Clairvius Narcisse's experience? Was it a pharmacological trick, a crime of forced labor, a psychiatric condition, or a blend of causes? Leave your thoughts below, and if you found this account useful, consider reading more widely to see how different disciplines try, and sometimes fail, to answer questions at the edge of life and death.